I'm Andy Dyer. I'm here to talk about my experience working with React Native, hopefully to give you some things to consider when deciding whether it's right for your projects. Start by mentioning Zalando, which is where I work in Berlin. If you're not familiar with us, do online fashion retail, free shipping, free returns, all that good stuff, so you can shop without going to stores. Okay, and I guess we can start by asking who here is familiar with React or React Native, the architecture in general? Okay, a few of you. I'll go through just quickly a little bit of background. Obviously, there's tons of other talks giving a full intro to React Native itself. My goal here is just to make sure we can talk about its pros and cons. So, okay, first off, why you might want to use React Native. Really fast iteration of your UI development. As you've probably seen in all the flashy demos, you can make changes, save it, and see them on the screen in a matter of a couple seconds, which if any of you do iOS and Android, you're used to checking Twitter and getting coffee while you're waiting for your changes to build and deploy. So yeah, this is one of the big selling points. Another thing you often hear about is cross-platform, which it is, but that takes some work. You don't want to build an app that looks like it doesn't belong on either platform, so you do need to take some care to make sure that things look native. And then finally, and this is the case for me, just learning something new. I've been doing Android since Froyo, and it's matured a ton. But yeah, opportunity came up to do something new. I used to do some JavaScript. Turns out it's changed completely since I last did it. Nobody uses jQuery anymore, for example. And we have classes now, lots of cool things like that. So yeah, let's see, what else was I going to say? Oh yeah, and I'll apologize in advance. All of anything I'm talking about native is going to be from an Android perspective. I'll do my best to like translate to iOS. But yeah, the code and you'll see Android a lot on these slides. Okay, so a bit about the React architecture for those of you who aren't familiar with it. These days, most Android, iOS apps are using some variant of MVP or MVVM. It's a little different here in React Native. You basically have your UI component at the top there, and it's, like it says, your UI. Anytime you do something like click on a button, an action is triggered, and then that will most likely change some state somewhere. Anytime the state changes, the UI is re-rendered, so there's this just endless loop of action, state change, render, and so on. And one benefit to this approach, yeah, it's blinking a lot. One benefit to this approach is a unidirectional data flow. So if you make a change, you don't have to remember to go and update your UI. It's going to update automatically, which is nice. So yeah, it's a different way of thinking. And next, I'll go through just a quick sample app so you can visualize how some of this fits together. Yeah, there's a link. This presentation is online. I can point you to that later, but yeah, you can actually run this in a browser if you wanted to. So yeah, these are import statements. I know iOS and Android have something similar, so hopefully that's not too surprising. And if you're wondering what the syntax means, this here would be like the default import, and then this is a named import. So you can have one or more of the named imports, but always a single default. So this is importing a couple dependencies from React. And then here are the React Native specific dependencies we're using. You can guess from the names basically what they are. They're slightly different than their iOS and Android counterparts, but yeah, nothing too surprising there. And then, yeah, declare the component. Yeah, just like in Java, at least I can't speak for Objective-C, but yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, extends component, this export default, that's how you would say which is the default export for this particular module, like we saw above. And then, yeah, constructors, calling to super, nothing too crazy there. Initializing our state to an empty string. The render method. And for those of you who have not seen any React Native code, this is where it starts to get a little weird, because we've got HTML in the JavaScript, and separation of concerns. This is weird. Why do you do this? It works. So it's normal, basically, is the point here. So here we're defining a text input. These little curly braces are like inline code. I bet this is the dongle doing this. Sorry. Okay, and yeah, this is a placeholder text, and then this method gets called when you change the text. And then here, this is basically a ternary, where you have a text, so this is the text that gets rendered based on the input. And yeah, hello and your name, if we've specified a name, otherwise null. And then this is the function that sets the state. Yeah, it's got this lambda-like syntax. It's kind of cool, makes you feel like a hacker when you write it. And then styles. Anybody who's done some web development, it's very similar to CSS. So nothing too wild there. If you're on Android, then these are DPs, and on iOS, I believe they're pixels. Okay, and then finally at the bottom, this is where we tell the React Native about our component so that it can load it on the native side. So we're giving it this name, and that's basically how it all fits together. I'm not going to show the native side because you all most likely know what native code looks like, so yeah. So next, we will move on to how you integrate React Native with an existing app. So yeah, I'm not going to go through setting it up from scratch because there's generators. You just run a single command, and that's pretty easy. So we'll go a little bit deeper and talk about how to get it work with an existing app. So again, from the Android perspective here in a second, but you create a package.json file, and where you give like your module a name, and you run yarn, and that pulls down all the dependencies, including React, React Native, other dependencies that those libraries use. And you end up with this node modules directory, which if you look in there, it has not only the things you expected to see, but a long, long, long list of everything else. It's kind of scary, really. Don't look in there very often. But the way you include the app in Android, or include React Native in your Android project, is by adding a path reference in your settings.gradle to that project, which is coming down from Node, mind you. It's not like a Maven dependency or anything like that. It's weird. This isn't how we normally put dependencies in an Android project. Then you add the dependency to your build.gradle, and you add an activity that loads the JavaScript component. And this is the steps that Facebook gives you in the in the getting started example. And let's see. Finally, you run yarn start, which starts the packaging server. The packaging server is what serves up JavaScript changes as you hit save and causes the device to show the changes right away. So yeah, bundle up the JavaScript and launch your app, and you've got React Native in there. So yeah, pretty easy, right? No. Of course not, right? I wouldn't be talking about it if it was that easy. So does anybody have any guess about what kind of problem I might have run into? Okay. So here we go. In our case, and this was a few months ago. React Native is on version 0.51 now. So the point here isn't that I had this particular problem. It's the nature of the problem. We'll get to that. So yeah, at the time React Native was using this old version of OKHTTP. Our app was using a newer version. And for those of you who are familiar with OKHTTP, they release lots of versions quite often. A lot of times they'll move dependencies into new packages, and yeah, that was the case here. So it's just totally breaking change, and they would not play together. I guess can also mention if you're an Android developer and you're playing Conference Talk Bingo, there's your first Square library mention. So yeah, so then the first thing I did, like all of us, go to Stack Overflow, because like somebody's surely run into this problem and been kind enough to share the answer, right? Didn't find too much helpful on Stack Overflow, so the next thing you do is go to GitHub on the repo and start reading the issues. And Yeah, so this is, and I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but basically, some kind soul went out and made a pull request to React Native to upgrade the version of OKHTTP. That's like all you need to do, right? Not really, because as you look here, it's talking about, well, this would have to update every app at Facebook. It's not so simple. Someone will do it eventually. And yeah, and then they're blaming Square for updating their library too often. Um, yeah, so at this point I was like, I don't even want to do this. Like, why? It's not worth it. Um, and so then we start looking at like, well, how do we actually, what's another way to solve this? Someone suggests embedding the version and renaming it. You can use dependency shading. If any of you haven't done this, it's a pretty cool concept that you can even do it, but there are libraries, at least on Android, where you can say, okay, this Square library, let's rename it to this other one, and then, yeah, you can do that, but yeah, at this point I was I'm totally done with this. So then, there's more. So like 4 months later, that pull request got merged, and then suddenly it went from 3.8 back down to 3.6, and then there's another. So it's just, yeah. And I've complained to some JavaScript web developers, and they're like, "Yeah, welcome to JavaScript. Like this is how it goes." And so then I'm like really over it. But I mean, I persisted because we were on a project where we wanted to use this, so had to find a way. So there's a few different ways to integrate React Native in your app. The first one's the one I described from their docs, but that has well, let's go back. So that has a major problem. If you're like most companies, you probably have your iOS app in one repo, you have your Android app in another repo. How are you going to add it directly to both and share the code? There's maybe some modules, but that's gross. So had to find another way. So what we ended up doing is packaging the dependencies in our own library. So for on Android, that meant packaging up React Native itself, because Facebook doesn't give it to you as an AAR, so you have to build it yourself. And then any dependencies you're using that have native code also have to be packaged up. So you end up with an AAR that's published in Maven, and all the dependencies get pulled in. It's okay, but it's definitely not their officially supported way. But we got something working. And then we had other teams in the company that wanted to add their React Native features into the app. And they're like, oh, okay, so how do we package this thing? And we realized, like, okay, this process is very manual. It's not scalable. Very hard to explain to people that are outside the team. So what we're currently looking at is something called Electrode Native from, believe it or not, Walmart. I was like, what? Walmart open source? Well, they are a giant company, and their apps use a ton of React Native, so I decided it was worth giving a look. And at this point, I can say it's pretty promising. It has versioning compatibility checks. So you can say for a given version of React Native, these are the versions of these libraries that are compatible. And it'll force that. Like, you can't add a dependency that you haven't said ahead of time is compatible. And then you can also do it does the packaging for you. They call it a container, but yeah, on Android it's an AAR. On iOS, it's a library. And yeah, it's pretty nice. There's a lot to learn. I had to spend like a couple days with the documentation to get like a sample working. But it does seem like it'd be something that's very scalable and repeatable, which is what we're after. So probably at some point could do a whole other talk on that. But yeah, worth looking into if you're not familiar and you have this kind of problem. Okay, so another thing some of you might have heard about React Native is this whole patent thing. So yeah, this is basically a quote directly from this blog post. And Facebook recently changed the license of things like React itself and GraphQL to make it more like the open source license we're used to. For some reason, React Native is still this BSD plus patents license, which yeah, basically means if you sue Facebook for something, you lose the license to React Native. So kind of sounds a lot like the mobster, nice app you got there kind of thing. So yeah, and you would think that this would be enough to scare most people away, but there are tons of startups that from the ground up use React Native for everything. So yeah, it's kind of surprising to me. I've talked to people at meetups and conferences, and nobody seems very concerned about this. But yeah, another thing along the same lines, that WordPress had a rewrite called Gutenberg that was using React. And as I mentioned, the React Native or the React license has since been updated. But at the time while that was going on, they're like, well, we're out of here. So they decided to completely rewrite their rewrite with a different library. So all that's to say, yeah, there's a lot going on here, and I guess the main consideration is that it's like a really big dependency, and as I showed with the OKHTP situation, it can limit your ability to upgrade other libraries. I'd also like to point out, if anybody's not familiar with the movie Office Space, it just kind of describes like very depressing office life. And yeah, they have this scene in the movie where they have this, is this good for the company thing? And I guess the reason I chose this image is because you have to think when you're going to use an open source project from a company, they built it for themselves first and foremost. And if your interests don't align with theirs, or you expect them to change at some point in the future, yeah, you should consider that. Yeah, assuming you're still not deterred, and I want to say my goal here is not to scare people away. I'm just trying to be real. So assuming this doesn't have you running away in fear, we can talk now about what it's like to actually develop with React Native, especially coming from a native perspective. So first off, you could use Android Studio to edit the text files, but it's not made for that. It's made for Android. So you're going to pick a text editor that's more suited to the job. There are several. I started with Atom. There's a bunch of good plugins for that. But I more recently switched to Microsoft's Visual Studio Code, which is another weird thing. Like, I'm using a Facebook library. I'm using a Microsoft text editor. Is this even Android anymore? But VS Code has some really good integration with JavaScript. So it's text-based, but you still get a little bit of autocomplete. It can resolve your import paths and things like that for you. So yeah, it's not too bad. Then the next very important thing you'll use is the Chrome developer tools. That will let you inspect variables and hit breakpoints, things like that. Visual Studio Code will also do some of that for you. And then, yeah, in general, it's a bit more typing than probably what you're used to with Android or iOS. But you're not waiting on build time, so there's less time to check Twitter. I'm not sure it's really a good thing, but that's the reality. Okay, so we've all heard all the negative things about JavaScript. This is kind of a perfect analogy because cars and carpet have nothing to do with each other except for having the same first three letters. But as I mentioned, people aren't using jQuery anymore. There's classes. So the language has kind of evolved. But if you're coming from a statically typed language like Swift or Kotlin, you're going to probably want to use types because types are good. So there's two of these. It's kind of a religious war like Vim and Emacs. TypeScript works great with Visual Studio Code, which was one of the reasons we went with it, and I'll show some of the code here in a second. But if you're coming from Swift or Kotlin, it looks very similar syntax-wise. Flow's Facebook's kind of version of the same thing. You definitely want to configure a linter, especially if you're new to JavaScript. Airbnb makes or open source a very good set of lint rules, and I found it really valuable for like learning the finer points of the language because it enforces almost everything. And then another really cool thing, there's a library called Prettier, and it has all kinds of options, but one we decided to use on our team was to just auto-format on save. So in code reviews, you're not arguing about spacing and all kinds of other things. And you can also be really lazy. You just don't indent. You just write the code, and as you go to the next line, hit save, whatever, it just looks nice. So yeah, it's kind of cool. All right, so let's see a little bit about TypeScript here. And I didn't go into this detail when I was giving kind of the brief intro to React Native, but there's two types of things that will cause your component to render. The first is props or properties, and these are read-only values that get passed in, basically like you could think of them as constructor parameters in essence. And then there's state, and state, anytime it changes, will cause a re-render. So here's a few examples with TypeScript of, a property and, a value and its corresponding type. So nothing too crazy there. We define these interfaces here at the top. So down here, we can specify their types here. If, in plain React Native, there's a similar way to do this, but it's not as like explicit. So yeah, this looks very much like what you probably see in Kotlin and Java and even some Swift, as I saw in BJ's talk earlier. And then yeah, this looks very similar to the set name method we saw in the previous example. But yeah, we've got types there, and this is another cool thing I found in ES6, which is, I guess, the current version of JavaScript, this interpolation, which both Swift and Kotlin have. So yeah, nothing too crazy. I guess the only thing to mention about TypeScript, if you're not familiar with it, is it does add an extra step, because if you write plain JavaScript, that's your app. But TypeScript, you write TypeScript, and then there's a build step that compiles that into JavaScript. You never have to look at the JavaScript, but when you're setting up your build process, it's like this extra step that you have to be aware of. But it's worth it, because types, they're good. Okay, so yeah, as you can see, there's quite a few new concepts to learn here. And there's always, as you might expect, a few things that aren't so great. On Android, we all know, or those of you who do Android know, that this is not how you handle orientation changes. But in React Native, I did some Stack Overflow searching. It doesn't really seem to be a better way. So this is pretty common in apps to do that, which means you're telling the operating system, like, I'm okay, I'll handle this myself, only most people don't handle it. So yeah, weird things can happen, especially like if the language changes, you're not going to get the configuration change that would trigger the reload. And then this is also bad, locking to portrait, but that's another option. And then, coming from Android, where we have all these libraries from Google, like the support library, the design support library, and so on, you don't really have that in React Native. Facebook gives you React Native, and luckily there are third-party libraries for things like material design and internationalization. But it seems a little weird because you're having to pick and choose from a bunch of things that aren't officially sanctioned by the company providing you the tool. But it works. And then I'll show an example shortly, but you can have your JavaScript code called native code, but it requires some extra classes. So yeah, that brings us to the second consideration. It's totally different than normal Android development. You'll have some native code, but you're going to spend more of your time in the text editor than you will probably in the native code. So let's see here. Oh yeah, and I guess it's worth mentioning, if you've got a team of like longtime Android engineers, convincing them to change to do this is probably going to be a hard sell with like Kotlin and all the stuff Android Studio gives you. But yeah, as I said earlier, if you want to learn something new, it's a great way to do that. So yeah, I mentioned that changing code and seeing on a device instantly is like a really good thing because you can build apps really fast. This is obviously a darker take on it, but yeah, it's true in a way. Like if you don't think about what you're doing, you can create a mess really fast. So yeah, but we had the same problem in Android. You get into Android, and until recently, all the Google tutorials would say, in the activity, write all your code, because that's where you should put it, right? And then we've since learned, no, model view presenter, things like that. And now with the architecture components, Google's like started suggesting good architecture. And yeah, the same here. Like usually the tutorial you get as a beginner is not what you're actually going to do for a production app. So yeah, that's there just kind of as a joke. Okay, so one proven way to ensure the quality of your app is to test it as much as possible. arguably even more important in a language like JavaScript that if you're not using something like TypeScript can lead to all kinds of problems. So we have a few different ways to test on React Native. The one that's set up out of the box in a brand new app is called Jest. That's a library from Facebook. And that allows you to do snapshot testing, which is basically a shallow render of your component, and it saves it. And then if that changes, like maybe you make some UI changes, that snapshot test would fail. And in a lot of cases, you knew that it was going to fail because you changed something. But in other cases, you might change some code and think everything's fine and not know that you made a UI bug. So yeah, it's very useful for that. And it's also a good way to get code coverage if you're just strictly after that, because it executes a lot of your code to make those snapshots. You can also do some lightweight unit testing, but there's a couple other tool I'll mention in a second that's maybe a little better for that. There's another library called Detox from a company called Wix, and that gives you UI testing similar to Espresso on Android. And then finally, another Airbnb library, we have Enzyme, which is more like Roboelectric from the Android perspective, in that it mocks a lot of the React Native dependencies and is a lot more performant for a lot of tests that would involve rendering than Jest. But yeah, these are all very useful tools for that. So yeah, I mentioned the cross-platform and how there's some platform-specific things you'll need to do. So we can talk a bit about that. So first and foremost, the best practices are evolving. There's a couple ways I'll show in a second to do this. But yeah, it's in a lot of ways, the React Native community is like Android was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Like, we were building apps, but we knew there had to be a better way, and we eventually worked towards that. And that's the same thing that's happening now with React Native, in my opinion. And yeah, the two biggest questions are like, how much code should you share, and what's okay to duplicate? I've talked to some people. They say if there's any variance, they'll just have an iOS set of code and an Android set of code. Other people want to just have things that are different be different and the rest be the same. It really depends on your approach. And in some cases, you're going to need purely native code. And there's a way to do that. You can call a method from the JavaScript side and have an implementation on iOS and implementation on Android. As long as they implement the same interface, it doesn't really matter how they do the job behind the scenes. You can use your iOS networking library or Android networking library. So in our case, we have a lot of tracking code that's very complicated, and we don't want to rewrite all that. So yeah, native module is a perfect place to just have the JavaScript call through to some native code that already exists. So that's a good way to take advantage of React Native without rewriting your whole app. Okay. So yeah, I mentioned there's a couple different ways to specify your platform-specific behavior. The simplest is just an if statement. Not really the best idea unless it's a very minor difference. So I wouldn't recommend using this one too much. And this is probably a little bit better option. It's just a naming convention. So if I had a file that was just index.js, it would load that on both platforms. If you put Android or iOS, then it will load the appropriate file for that platform. And depending on how you set up your code, you can actually split like shared stuff into a third file, and then have these two files vary in the places where they're different, and then where the shared code needs to be, you put it in there. And I'd like to apologize to this side of the room. I realize I'm looking over here a lot. I'll try to. The screens on both sides are, yeah. Okay. So yeah, I like this approach better because it's more explicit. You can tell when you're looking at the code that, okay, this is different, rather than having to dive down into some method and see that, oh, that's where the platform-specific stuff is happening. So yeah, this brings us now to our third consideration, and that's that if you want to have clean and maintainable code, it really takes the commitment of everyone on the team. If you just have a bunch of enthusiastic developers writing a bunch of code without really thinking about what you're doing, you have that situation of the bad app really fast that we saw earlier. So, okay, I always have to see how these look on the screen. It looks different here by a little bit. Okay, so probably one of the biggest selling points of React Native, and one of the reasons we're interested in it, is the ability to push app updates without, or push updates without going through a proper app release on Google Play or the App Store. And we don't need to read all this. Some of you maybe already have. But basically what they're saying is, yeah, we made an app and we submitted it to the app stores and it didn't get rejected. That's not the same as like Apple or Google saying, yeah, this is okay. So yeah, it's a little bit of a gray area. And yeah, this is how they justify that it's okay. And yeah, it's, I don't know, it's not the best explanation, but there's tons of people using code push. Again, it's similar to the license, like, well, everyone else is doing it, there don't seem to be problems. So yeah, it is something that can be useful. But as you might expect, there's a few best practices to use when wielding such a hammer. And the first thing you want to do is check for app updates when your app starts, but then you typically apply them on the subsequent launch. That's so that the app launches quickly, and you don't surprise the user. And you want to test thoroughly and monitor your releases. There is a capability to do rollbacks, but if you're doing A/B testing and you're doing dynamic app releases, it can get very complicated. So yeah, you should have a strategy for how you're going to manage that. And yeah, as I said, don't surprise the user. That's probably the best rule. You don't want the UI to completely change while they're in the middle of using the app. So yeah, it's probably the fourth and final consideration. And yeah, that's that they should be used responsibly. You might be wondering why I chose Spider-Man. It's the great power, great responsibility quote that people often say from the movie. Yeah, okay. So yeah, now that you have some ideas for how to decide if React Native is right for you, we can go through quickly an example using native modules, how you can get some of the benefits of the UI prototyping without too much of the JavaScript weirdness. Okay, so you have an existing app and you want to do the UI in React Native. As the Android folks in the room know, at I/O this year, Google introduced their architecture components, and one of the pieces of that is live data. It's basically an observable where your data changes will just get pushed to the UI anytime there's something new. Sorry. All right, wrong key. All right, a lot of my code examples involve beer. So this is Kotlin code here. We have this live data module. You extend React context-based Java module to say that you want some code that interacts with the JavaScript side. And skip over all the dependency injection and property stuff there. Annotate your method with React Native. That's any method that you want to expose to the JavaScript side. And then you define your, in this case, we're subscribing to these updates. So we're going to list the beers and just observe them. So we've got this live data object. And then unsubscribe, same thing, except, so here we're just removing the observer when you unsubscribe. And finally, this is where we handle the changes. So anytime that list changes, this is a React-specific class, but it's basically a map or dictionary. So we're just going to put this string and the JSON representation of that list in there. And then we're going to, this is a React Native thing where you're basically saying, I'm going to emit this beer's changed event and pass this value. And yeah, those class names are kind of gross. They look very iOS-y with this RCT stuff. So, so next, this is on the React Native side. And yeah, again with the iOS style names. We set up a change listener that listens to that beers changed event, and we're going to call our JavaScript method when that changes, and then we subscribe to those updates. And then kind of do the opposite, remove the listener and unsubscribe from the updates there. And then finally, anytime we get new ones, we're going to set the state, which as we saw earlier is going to re-render the component. So yeah, you could have your UI built in React Native and use all your existing Android code with an approach similar to this. You could do the same thing with RxJava instead of live data or plain old Kotlin or Java code, Swift, whatever. So yeah, so you can kind of get the benefits of it without completely rewriting your app if you're interested in that. So to recap, yeah, these are the things to consider if it's worth it for you. Definitely a big dependency and some legal issues around it that people don't seem to be too concerned about. And it's way different than normal Android or iOS development, which may or may not be a good thing depending on your perspective. Having the clean and maintainable code requires everybody on the team to be committed to that. And finally, dynamic code updates need to be used responsibly. So yeah, I'll close with some links. I don't have the slides up there yet, but there's my blog. Zalando, always hiring. There's the URL. Some of you may know my friend Sergey Zhuk, if I'm saying his name correctly. He and some other friends of mine have a Medium publication on Android or about Android, so lots of articles there about just professional Android development in general. And yeah, there's me on Twitter. If you're wondering about the name, that's a childhood nickname. I was like probably 3 or 4, and my mom's friend asked me what my name was, and that's what I told her. So yeah, my mom was a little embarrassed by that, and she's even more embarrassed that it's my Twitter handle. Yeah. So yeah, I'll take some questions if there are any.
Okay, thank you. And question about, from the business perspective, for example, I have some idea. I need to have the application for Android and for iOS. And should I use it for implementation, or it's just for enthusiasts who has a lot of money, like Facebook or Walmart? So should I use it for my startup, or should I use native apps for Android and iOS? Will it save my time, money, etc.?
Yeah, yeah.
So, thank you.
So yeah, one of the things I should have mentioned at conferences when I talk to people who are using React Native, the people who are having the best experience with it are the ones who started their app from scratch with it. Anytime I would talk to someone about the problems I was having, like integrating with an existing app, they're like, oh, you know. So like, yeah, it's definitely seems easier if it's from the ground up. First question, do you already have like, the app started, or are you just talking hypothetically? Yeah. Yeah, if it was a new project and you start with React Native and all your code's in one repo, I've heard of startups that have a React web app that's sharing some of the React components with React Native. So you can all the way down like web, mobile, it can all be like React flavored. And if you have some web developers instead of mobile developers, you can have like one very good JavaScript developer could build an app where you might have to have an iOS and an Android engineer. So yeah, that could save you money. One consideration there though is you would want the web developer to have a pretty good knowledge of Android and iOS, because I've seen when somebody comes from a React background into React Native, they don't know the finer points of the two platforms. So like in our case, we have an iOS engineer, myself, and a web person on the team, so we kind of get the benefits of all those perspectives. So yeah, I guess it could save money and time if done correctly. But I mean, you could say the same thing about Android and iOS. If you do it wrong, it's not going to save you money or time. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Hi, thank you for your speech.
Thank you.
Could you share a bit your experience around solving problems with layout? For example, when you change device orientation or whatever.
Yeah, the device orientation thing is actually on my list to look at, because like we have, in some cases, we have a different layout on tablet than we do on the phone. So that's on my list of things to look at. I think you'd probably, hopefully similar to the way it works on Android, where you just load a different layout. I don't think that would be too hard to do. You just have to know before you load the component which layout you're in. It should be possible, but to be honest, I haven't done that yet. It's on the list.
Thank you for your question.
Hi. I have a question about the community. What about the community of React? Is it okay, supported, or it's not? What about the solving the problems and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in general, as a lot of you know, every platform has like the community's a little different. But so far, I've been to some meetups, and the people there are really friendly. A lot of people are very new to this, so there's a lot of knowledge sharing going on. And I went to a conference in Wrocław, Poland recently, and it was a lot of fun. Like, everybody's really friendly. Met some interesting people. They have a lot of fun, but yeah, when it comes time to actually writing code and sharing knowledge, I'd say it's a healthy, growing community, just like the ones we have in iOS and Android. Anybody else?
Hello. My question is, what's about UI components that doesn't exist in other devices? Like in Android, we have checkboxes, radio buttons, but in iOS we don't have this. We have only just switches.
Yeah, so one case where we have some of those cross-platform differences I was talking about, a simple list on iOS. If you want to expose like more actions, you swipe, and there's the buttons you can add there, like delete or more. And on Android, we have like an option button, and it shows a pop-up menu. So yeah, it's totally doable. That's one of those cases where you'd have the index.android and the index.ios because they're so vastly different. But what we did in that row like options case is we had some shared code that was rendering the list and all of that common stuff, and then those index.android and iOS specific files were just wrapping that and applying the pop-up menu in the Android case or the row swiping behavior on iOS. There's another topic that I didn't go into here, but in React Native called higher order components, and you can basically have a component and then wrap it in some other behavior. It's basically composition. And so you could use that to do things like, oh, I have a basic UI component, but I want to wrap it in a tracking component that knows how to track actions, or I want to wrap two components in an A/B testing component that will load one or the other. So like, yeah, there's ways to do some pretty cool stuff, like once you dig a little deeper into. I should also add, I've learned quite a lot by just going and reading plain old React blog posts. Conceptually, a lot of things are the same. You're not using the same build tools and all that, but you're still rendering components, and yeah, there's a lot to be learned there. So another good tip.
Thank you for your speech. What about TV platforms, how it handles focuses and HLS and so on? Android TV, I mean.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I didn't quite.
Could I work with React Native with Android TV, like handle focus changes and so on?
I know there is a variant that will allow you to build like React Native for Apple TV. There's also one for Windows. So yeah, there's a lot of different platforms that'll let you build for different platforms. I'm not 100% sure on Android TV though. Okay, great. He's giving a React Native talk as well, so go to that.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but I actually know the answer for this question. Apple TV is officially supported and the code is merged, but Android TV is on the way. The PR is there, but it's not yet fully functional. But again, the focus issues, the D-pad and all that stuff coming soon.
What about saving and restoring changes across activity restart?
Okay, so if you're, well, I guess the first question is, where's the business logic? Is it in the JavaScript side or the native side?
I mean, is there some automatic mechanism that saves changes into a bundle on Android?
Okay,
And
well, so once your activity or fragment, I forgot to mention, you can actually load React Native in fragments, so you get some more ways to do your UI. Once you load the JavaScript in the activity, like most of the activity lifecycle is just, I wouldn't say it's ignored because the React Native activity base class calls through to all the lifecycle events. But as you saw with that configuration changes pack, that doesn't require you to do the save and restore, at least for orientation changes. If you had state like you wanted when the user came back later, that's where you'd probably have something like Redux persist, which if all of your state is in Redux, Redux is a whole other concept I didn't touch on here, but Redux is like a global state container, so instead of you just setting the state directly in the component, it would be global. And there's something called Redux persist that could save like all that state and restore it when the app comes back. So yeah, you could restore like the exact navigation hierarchy and everything that the user saw before they left the app if you wanted to. It just takes a little bit of work to set it up and save it. So that's probably the way I would do that.
thank you.
Okay, we're out of time. If anyone wants to come find me, or sure. Anyone else has questions or wants to talk, just come find me.
Thank you for speech. As I know, Reactive Native it's about beta or even about alpha. So my question is, how often Facebook breaks the API?
Okay. Well, all of these, like if a new version of React Native comes out, I found you don't update right away because all the libraries you're using, a lot of them may not work with it. So yeah, once you find a combination of dependencies that work, like until there's a really good reason to update them, I would just kind of stick with what's working. Oh, sometimes there will be a new version of React Native that solves a very specific problem and you need it, and then maybe you would do it. But yeah, certainly don't go just updating versions because there's a new version, because yeah, bad things will happen. And yeah, you touched on a good point too, that React Native is using sometimes an alpha or beta version of React itself. There's certain libraries like Enzyme that will only work with released versions of React. So if you see a new version of React Native and it's using an alpha version of React, there's a good chance you won't be able to use Enzyme with that. So yeah, there's a lot of these things you just have to be aware of.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.